come in and want to, at what point is capitalism going to turn into individual business owner greed or a CEO kind of greed, which we still have today? And at what point, you were talking about private market, free market as opposed to state-run market, government-run market. Well, then what you said is killing the golden goose. Suddenly the state takes over, and they're the robber barons. They're the ones that want this money.
Sure.
They become greedy. Because right now we're regulated to death. Here in Michigan alone, I think we have some of the highest business taxes in the country. To start a business in the here in Michigan, if you're a plumber, good luck.
Yeah.
Just because of the amount of money it's going to take, you have to pay your lawyers all kinds of money and it has to be done in triplicate. At what point, I guess, do you have regulation and oversight? Again, this is kind of a general question, and there is no real answer, I guess. But in your opinion, based on your understanding of economics, Austrian economics, at what point does the state step in, or should we have something like Underwriters Lab, who oversees private businesses? Right now, the UL is internationally recognized.
Okay.
If you see a UL listing, that's an oversight committee, but it's not government or state-owned.
Mm-hmm.
It's an independent oversight. And I guess my contention is we can have independent oversight. Because right now we have oversight over everything based on the government. We just had a peanut epidemic that was salmonella or whatever. And the response was, well, by the FDA, we didn't have enough people on the ground because we don't have enough money.
Sure.
So we screwed up, give us more money.
Yeah.
And for whatever reason, people say, okay.
Sure.
So it's just as corrupt. So I guess my question is, would you rather depend on a free market with independent, non-government, non-state-run oversight, or would you rather have state-run? I think I know your answer, but I mean, do you see a benefit either way, or how do you?
There is no benefit to any government whatsoever. So we'll start with that statement. You spoke of capitalism, and then you used terms like monopolies and robber barons and such. This is the history. This is the product of you and I and most everyone we know going through a 13-year indoctrination process known as government schools. I don't like to use the word public schools. I call them government schools.
Well said.
If you go back and look at some revisionist history of those things that stick out in your head from 8th grade through 12th grade government classes, the terms, people, I get these quite often from people. What about the robber barons? What about the oil barons? What about the railroaders? All of these horrible people that the government... This is a pretty common theme. I mean, this has been drilled into people's heads for a long time. Mm-hmm. Go look at the revisionist history on it. Go look at the real history on it. What you'll always find, is that these so-called bad guys were working in collusion with the government to pass the regulations that supposedly put them at bay. Okay, almost every case I've ever studied, I come from different angles of who the benefactors were, and maybe they frog marched out a certain guy, but there was usually one of them, usually one of the big bankers or one of the big corporatists who came across as being altruistic. Well, I believe I should pay my share. The country's been good to me, and I'm a wealthy man. I should be regulated more. There'll usually be one like that marched out in the historical timeline, but inevitably, it's always this collusion, this partnership between the politicians and the politically connected class, and it's always done to benefit them, to create more regulation that protects them, reduces competition for them, and is always harmful to everyone else. I can't think. You'd have to give me time to research anyone, but pull one out, and I'm sure I can find it.
Understand? And they're still doing that today. If you look at some of the laws that go through Michigan legislation, they'll have tax breaks for a city block, literally a city block.
Yeah.
A lot of people assume our elected government is doing their job, but if you actually look at some of the bills that are passed, they have bills that say from this city block to this city block, because they're not giving it, let's say it's a brick-making company. Brick-making company, the guy goes to the same church as his legislator in his district. Well, look, we're under a lot of pressure right now, and because of some of the NAFTA and whatever, we have a lot of
10,000
competition.
for your campaign.
Right. Can you please somehow hook us up with some kind of a tax break?
Right.
And lo and behold, the company doesn't get it, but some square mile of a city or a township gets it. And people don't see this, and that's cronyism at its best. And what happens is that's corruption, bottom line. And so the same thing is happening today, maybe at a much smaller scale, but it's still happening.
Right.
And I think with what you said, I would agree with revisionist history, because a lot of people aren't aware of that very thing.
One thing I'd like to add to your topic of monopolization. Monopolies are bad. And that's a message that we've all understood, but I'd make 2 points there. One, in a free market, monopoly is nearly impossible, and if you have one, it's probably short-term in a true free market without protection. Two, I could expand on that maybe a little later, but two, if monopolies are bad, why would you want an institution that has a monopoly on the use of force and violence, and that is the state? That is the ultimate monopoly. That is where the worst people in society rise to seize that power, to be able to unify, collaborate with their closest friends and run the country to the way that benefits them. That's the monopoly that we should be afraid of.
Understood. All right, I thank you, Dave. I think we have Erwin Haas hopping back on to take care of you.
Thank you very much, Dave. I was anxious to try to relieve you because you've been such a champion. You've been on for at least an hour. And I thought I'd supplement Dave's observations on what rank capitalism looks like, raw capitalism, unmitigated by much government. We lived in the Hill District downtown when we first moved to town. And this was the old wealthy section. And there's a very magnificent property there, which we almost bought. It's called the Castle. And you know exactly what I'm talking about. It's on the corner of College and Cherry, maybe.
Yes.
Okay. And kitty corner and across the road from there is the Morris Estate or something.
There's a Meyer May house out that way, too.
Yes, and that's further down south.
Right,
And
right.
he was a merchant and ran a successful store, and I'm not sure what happened to him in the long term. Anyway, we wanted to buy the castle, and so, we got the tour, and it turns out a doctor, a friend of mine, had owned this building, and it was built out of pure stone and oak. And I needed to make a doorway through that, and he said it took a guy 2 weeks to cut that door. He had another door cut somewhere else in that building. It was just incredibly well built. But the property itself had been commissioned by one guy. He went bankrupt. Somebody else bought what he had done, built it for a while. That guy went bankrupt. And the third owner finally finished it off. That was over the course of 3 or 4 years. So you get 3 capitalists, wealthy guys who are able to spend $100,000 in 1890, whenever that was, to build this thing. And 2 of them went bankrupt. And so the natural history of these robber barons, of the guys who made a lot of money, was that they kept it for a year, 2 years, 5 years, and then they went ruined. They were busted. And it's only the exceptional, the Rockefeller, the
Carnegie.
they stayed in the game a lot longer, and a lot of that was by corruption, by watering their stock, by being really shrewd players in the capital markets, and by having political buddies. And as it turns out, I also looked into the Morris Estate, which I think is now a Baptist church or something is in there. Magnificent property. And that it also had 3 owners before it was finally built. So somebody started it, went bankrupt. The second one built some more of it, went bankrupt, and the third one finally enjoyed the property. So that seems to be closer to what actually happened in the Gilded Era, the age of the late 1800s. The railroads were obviously a very good idea, and after the Transcontinental Railway was laid in 1867, I believe, there was just an explosion of building railroads, and they were building railroads everywhere you could imagine. And there was no need for all these railroads, and all the money was being poured into these things. And so all of a sudden, these owners of railroads looked around, and there was no business for them. And so they got together in big conferences and said, "Hey, we want to fix rates, and so that the farmer has to use us to get his stuff to market. We'll charge him twice what it really is worth, and we'll all agree so that he has no other place to go."
Kind of a price fixing.
Price fixing, exactly. And by the time they went back to Omaha and Chicago and Lansing, they reneged on those agreements. And so they could never enforce that. So we always hear about them fixing the rates, but they never really were effective. They'd always have to discount it to this guy and that guy because there were other options out there.
Right.
And so they were really, more and more of them were going bankrupt. They were just crying the blues. So they decided, hey, let's go to the state governments because we can deal with those guys, because we can own the politicians there. And they ultimately set up the ICC, the Interstate Commerce Commission. And that was specifically set up to enforce those cartels, so that these bloody railroads wouldn't go out of business, even if they weren't being very effective and economically inefficient. They could still not go bankrupt. So this was, I think, the first glimmering where the federal government became involved in trying to help a particular business. I'm sure I could find earlier examples of that, but they weren't quite as big and systemic as the railroads, because the railroads really had their finger at everything in the United States. And that was the beginning of the
end?
Some years later, you get the antitrust thing for
Right.
the Standard Oil. And Rockefeller was a shrewd operator. He actually produced a good product. And every year, the price of kerosene dropped and dropped and dropped and dropped because he was making it better. And he was really pinching all these other guys off who weren't as efficient.
Right.
But then there was always some other young guy who came around with a better chemical
Right.
process.
Had a better
drill
better
hole or
mousetrap.
something.
Understood.
And so he was always getting more and more competition.
Now, would he try and buy those people out and grab their technology, or would he basically starve
tried,
them?
and there was just more than they were coming out of the woodwork, like more and more rabbits. I mean, they were just being born all like crazy.
Now, let me ask you something. Go back to a couple things. You started with, how it all started, kind of with the railroads. In the late 1800s, 1867 was kind of when it happened. But obviously, with the Gilded Age, we start running into, through the Victorian period into the early 1900s. And something, the people that are watching, when we as libertarians talk about economics, we always bring up some certain books or certain things that are educational to know. Obviously, Dave Martin mentioned von Mises, Austrian School of Economics, Rothbard. There's a book by Hayek, The Road to Serfdom.
Yes.
You have, which are all good books, by the way. But there's one thing in particular that I think is interesting regarding the Federal Reserve, because we talked about how Andrew Jackson had, there was a second attempt at a Federal Reserve. He eliminated it.
Yeah, right.
If it weren't for his dealing with Native Americans, he'd probably be one of the better presidents. Unfortunately,
Right.
He did have a bad rap there.
Ministry.
Exactly. But I guess my question is this. There's a book out there, I think it's called The Creature from Jekyll Island. Are you familiar with that?
I've been to Jekyll Island within the last 6 months.